way it currently stands, forced labor, slavery takes precedence over rehabilitation and public safety.
Oh, by the way, while the Biden administration gives reparations to everyone but free people, look at the billions he has run over to Ukraine.
We don't have black grocery stores because if you think about it now, just to get in that supply chain, it's almost unheard of.
They don't want the truth to get out. Okay? I don't want to know what my family did or what all these people did and all this stuff like that. Okay?
Come on.
You read that 500-page report.
There's this thing called white superiority and black inferiority. That mindset allows all of the behaviors that we've seen across generations, allows for the construction of these policies and practices and systems and structures that continue to oppress us. This is not a handout. This is a debt that is owed.
You know, Allensworth was like the internet of his time in 1904, 1905.
The total black population in California is about 2.6 million, and then of that, the descendants compose about 2.2 million of that. So California, with a multi-billion-dollar surplus, can absolutely afford to satisfy the international terms for reparations, beginning with compensation.
Any financial obstacle that exists that impedes the success of increasing financial prosperity needs to be dealt with and eliminated.
No matter where we've been, no matter what part of this fight we've been in, we've been harmed, and we've had harm done to us specifically.
When I got to Los Angeles, this was some of the worst segregation I'd ever seen. And remember, I'm telling you, I'm from Mississippi.
Because as you can see, I'm giving you broken history right now, you know? But I had to give it to you guys today. I said, no, I got to show them this because it's so precious and nobody really knows about it.
Black people don't have that kind of luxury. Our historically black communities have been redistricted multiple times.
Now listen, if you can't handle the TR roof, don't tune in.
Hey family, so thanks for joining tonight. You got Kimmy in the house tonight, giving you Moya a little break. He's been burning through this report. Tonight we are on chapter 10, which is stolen labor and hindered opportunity. So before we get into it, let me get some background music going. But yeah, this chapter, just really I was listening to a interview with Tavis Smiley on TD Hip Hop. Go check that out if you haven't seen it already. Really insightful interview dealing with the Obama administration. But he Tavis threw out a stat when he was on there saying that Black people get paid 3/5 of what white people get paid. So basically, economically, we're still at that 3/5 standing. And this chapter will help us see how we got there. So let me just get this started. Flying solo tonight, so bear with me. All right, that sounds smooth. Hey, Darlene, thanks, fam, for showing up. I know you got your blue wrench, so appreciate you as usual. All right, chapter 10, stolen labor and hindered opportunity, and we are reading the California Reparations Task Force Interim Report, Chapter 10, Introduction. During enslavement, American government at all levels enabled and benefited from direct theft of African American labor. Since then, federal, state, and local government actions have directly segregated and discriminated against African Americans, and also paved the way for private discrimination in labor and employment. Federal, state, and local laws and policies, including those of California, have expressly and in practice limited what work African Americans can do and suppress African Americans' wages and opportunities for professional advancement. Federal laws have also protected white workers while denying the same protections to Black workers, setting up and allowing private discrimination. Government and private discrimination have contributed to the inability of African Americans to build wealth over generations. Although progress has been made, Black workers continue to face serious discrimination today. The badges and incidents of slavery have carried forward. The devaluation of African Americans, their abilities, and their labor did not end. It simply took different forms. Around the time of the Civil War, state and local governments passed laws known as Black Codes and Jim Crow laws. While these laws touched all aspects of life, one of their main goals was to control how African Americans earned a living in order to maintain African Americans as a servant class for white Americans. These laws limited African American job opportunities and salaries and their ability to provide for their families. The federal government itself directly discriminated against Black workers. Black workers were routinely excluded from federal employment until 1861, and in 1913, President Woodrow Wilson allowed for the federal workforce to be segregated. The segregated federal government promoted and regulated Black workers to lower paid jobs, and for instance, forced Black workers to use separate toilets in the Treasury and Interior departments. Although the military offered an opportunity for upward mobility for Black African Americans, its rank remained segregated until 1960, with lower pay and rank for Black service members, even as overall proportion of Black service members has grown. Military leadership has remained overwhelmingly white, with only 2 Black officials out of 41 holding 4-star rank in 2020. Research has produced evidence. Although federal government throughout history has passed laws, implemented policies, and made progress for the protecting workers, its efforts were often limited in time and impact, and often left out Black workers due to compromises with racist Southern legislators. After the Civil War, the Freedmen's Bureau provided for the welfare of previously enslaved African Americans, but it did so in a manner that reinforced racist notions and lasted only 7 years before being dismantled by Congress. Under pressure from white Southerners, the federal government failed to prevent white Americans from using violence and terror to limit African Americans' ability to earn a living, and certified unions that excluded Black workers. Federal labor protections under the New Deal, which aimed to help American workers' economic prospects, excluded or harmed African Americans. The Civil Rights Acts of 1964 included Title VII, which largely banned discrimination on the basis of race in employment. However, it did not remedy the discriminatory workplace structures that have accumulated for hundreds of years. In 1977, the Supreme Court limited these federal protections to only instances where an employee can prove that their employer intended to discriminate against them. An extremely high standard. Federal government affirmative action plans created in the 1970s did lead to an increase in the rate of minority employment in business that contracted with the federal government in those years, but an organized backlash now narrowed the scope and impact of these programs since in the early 1980s. Despite some progress in preventing labor discrimination against Black workers, the federal government has made little or no effort to address the harms of past government action. All right, let's see. Research has produced evidence that as a result of the legacy of enslavement and subsequent and ongoing discrimination, white workers are paid more than Black workers, and Black and white workers are concentrated in different types of jobs. As of 2019, median Black wage were equivalent to only 75.6% of white wages, falling from a height of 79.2% in 2000. Researchers estimate that between 1/4 to 1/3 of the wage gap between Black and white workers is due to racial discrimination. Without a safety net of savings, African Americans can be more vulnerable to upheavals in the labor market and less able to advocate for higher wage or other benefits. As of 2020, 19.5% of African Americans were living in poverty compared to 8.2% of non-Hispanic white Americans. Out of the 2021 S&P 500 and Fortune 500 companies, only 6 of the chief executive officers of those companies were African Americans. In 2020, African Americans held only 8.7% of the board seats in Fortune 500 companies. Similar patterns of government neglect and discrimination exist in California. Black workers did not hold many government jobs in the state until World War II, when Bay Area Rapid Transit was built in 1967. No skilled Black workers were hired because the National Labor Relations Board, NLRB, certified unions did not admit Black members. BART, through a government agency, refused to use its power to insist on non-discrimination policies by the unions. In 1996, California changed its constitution to ban the use of affirmative action in government employment and education with Proposition 209. Persistent discrimination and limited affirmative action have prevented African Americans from receiving the same wages and career opportunities as white Americans receive with government support. All facts, family, all facts. All right, can everybody hear me okay? I hope so. Let me check on the chat, see if anything's going on. Okay, hopefully everybody can hear me. Let's continue. This chapter recounts this long history and the continuing impact of discrimination in labor and employment. Section 3 provides a brief summary of enslavement, a subject explored in great detail in Chapter 2. Section 4 discusses discrimination in the laws enacted and government programs carried out from the Civil War forward, as well as government support of private discrimination in labor and employment. Section 4 also includes discussion of the advances and limitations of civil rights laws. Section 5 outlines the history and discrimination of government employment. The effects still seen today from centuries of discrimination are summarized in Section 6. Enslavement. The story of African Americans in the United States begins with stolen labor. The purpose of enslavement was to exploit the fruits of black labor for the benefit of mostly white Americans. For full discussion of enslavement, please see Chapter 2. The labor of enslaved African Americans built the infrastructure of the nation, filled the nation's coffers, and produced its main agricultural products for domestic consumption and export. Federal and state law treated African Americans themselves as commodities to be sold by enslavers. This system exploited the labor and love of black mothers to recreate and grow the enslaved labor force. Over the 200 plus years of slavery's existence in this country, enslavers extracted an estimated 14 trillion of labor from the human beings they enslaved. One recent study estimated that enslaved workers were responsible for somewhere between 18.7 and 24.3% of the increase in commodity output per capita nationally between 1839 and 1859. Through various forms of taxes and tariffs, often structured to protect the interests of enslavers, federal, state, and local governments all reap financial benefit from this condoned economic activity. Enslavement effectively led to separate labor markets for black and white Americans. White workers had access to a larger and more desirable selection of jobs, while free black workers were regulated to menial labor. Frederick Douglass observed, "Finding my trade of no immediate benefit, I threw off my caulking habiliments and prepared myself to do any kind of work I could get to do." Although there were fewer legal limitations on African Americans in the North, white workers were more motivated to reduce competition from African Americans, less threatened by free black workers in the South. White employers were more likely to employ black workers in, let's see here, I went up a little far, in skilled jobs than free black wage earners in the North. In 1860, for example, approximately 10% of black men in New York City worked in skilled trade, while in Richmond the figure was 32%, and in Charleston, where 1/3 of the population was black, 76 of black men worked in skilled trade. A few years earlier, in 1865, nearly 40% of black artisans in Philadelphia reported that unrelenting racial prejudice had compelled them to abandon their trades. California. As discussed in Chapter 2, enslavement existed in California into the mid-1860s. Enslavers brought enslaved African Americans with them when they moved west. Additionally, California passed its own fugitive slave law in 1852, and for 3 years that it was in force, it prevented courts from recognizing the freedom of those fleeing to California. California at the time strongly discouraged free African Americans from entering its territories. The relatively few free African Americans who resided in California in the late 1700s and the decades that followed tended to work as fur traders, scouts, cowboys, and miners. California's lack of government oversight allowed slavery to take hold in certain regions, including where enslavers brought African Americans to mine for gold. By 1852, 300 enslaved persons were involved in gold mining, with the enslaved person forced to work in other capacities. The California Fugitive Slave Act, coupled with California's law prohibiting the taking of testimony from a black person against a white person, posed a threat to the lives of both free and enslaved black residents. One enslaver from Mississippi, Charles Perkins, brought 3 enslaved men, Robert Perkins, Carter Perkins, and Sandy Jones, to California in 1849. Perkins later left the men behind with a friend who released them in 1951. The 3 freedmen then set up a freight hauling business and earned them over $3,000 in personal property, worth around $98,000 in 2020 dollars. But in 1852, the California Supreme Court ordered the 3 back to slavery in Mississippi. Wow. Government support of private discrimination. Following the Civil War, Congress created programs to benefit African Americans and passed statutes to protect their rights. But fierce opposition from white government officials undermined these programs and led to their premature end. While the Supreme Court undermined statutory protections allowing state and local legislatures to impose segregation. Throughout American history, as discussed in the preceding chapters, local and state governments, with the tacit approval of the federal government, passed many laws restricting black conduct. The Black Codes and Jim Crow laws aim to consolidate and maintain economic and political power generally in the hands of white Americans by controlling the type of work available to African Americans and how that work has been performed. This governmental discrimination against African Americans supported private employment discrimination until the Great Migration, as discussed in Chapter 1 and 5. The majority of African Americans lived in the South, and the majority of Southern Black families did not own land and were exploited by white landowners in the sharecropping system. Black women were mostly relegated to domestic service jobs well into the 20th century. When the federal government aimed to improve labor conditions in the 1930s with the New Deal, federal policies and programs often failed to benefit or even harmed African Americans, often by design. New Deal programs purposefully linked benefits like health care, paid vacations, pension, tuition, benefits, Social Security, and unemployment benefits to employment with large corporations, which at the time generally did not hire Black workers. Southern members of the House and Senate from states that passed laws to prevent Black workers from voting were instrumental in structuring the New Deal to exclude industries in which most Black workers were employed, like agriculture, domestic services, and casual labor. Yeah, healthcare, there's no reason healthcare should be attached to a job. That's just inhumane. When the federal government tried to remedy the racism faced by Black workers, the actions often lacked power. And that was an interjection, not part of the article, but yeah, we got to end that healthcare system for sure. All right, back to it. When the federal government tried to remedy the racism faced by Black workers, the actions often lacked power to enact real change and often lasted only a short time. Freedmen's Bureau short-lived paternalism. In the wake of the Civil War, the federal government created programs to aid African Americans and statutes to protect their rights. However, both failed to live up to their promise to give African Americans equal access to economic and labor opportunities or remedy the harms of slavery. Immediately before the end of the Civil War, Congress created a Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands to provide for the welfare of formerly enslaved African Americans, including through issues of provisions, clothing, and fuel as necessary for the immediate and temporary shelter and supply of destitute and suffering refugees and freedmen and their wives and children, according to the state. Commonly known as the Freedmen's Bureau, the agency had the authority to supervise labor relations in the South with the mandate to provide education, medical care, and legal protections for formerly enslaved African Americans, along with the authority to rent out and eventually sell allotments of abandoned or confiscated land to free African Americans. The original goal of the Freedmen's Bureau Act was the more radical notion of allowing African Americans the means to become self-sufficient. The radical notion of allowing African Americans the means to become self-sufficient. Clearly, that's still a radical notion. That's an interjection. Anyways, in the closing days of the Civil War, Union General William Tecumseh Sherman issued Special Field Order 15, number 15, setting aside 400,000 acres of confiscated land for those who had been freed. And 2 months later, the Freedmen's Bureau Act formalized the field order, providing that each Negro might have 40 acres at a low price on long credit. Many free African Americans and Northern Republicans believed the land reform in the South, granting formerly enslaved African Americans access to their own land, was the true way that formerly enslaved people would be free from their enslavers. All right, let's read that one more time. Many free African Americans and Northern Republicans believed that land reform in the South, granting formerly enslaved African Americans access to their own land, was the true way that formerly enslaved people would be free from their enslavers. All right. The resulting independent Black farmers would provide a power base for a new social and political order in the post-war South. This new vision of social relations in the South was opposed by Southerners as well as Northerners who opposed enslavement, but whose commitment was more to the notions of free labor and capitalism than racial equity. A large number of Black landowners would threaten plantations and disrupt the Southern economy and social system. White capitalism in the North and South believed that Black freedom should mean Black workers continuing to work on a plantation, although they would be paid. They did not believe that African Americans should be able to support themselves. Interjection, they still don't. All right. Support themselves independently through subsistence farming, which would have led to less cotton being grown and posed a threat to the interest of cotton merchants and other capitalists in the South. Elsewhere in the United States and in Europe, after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, who had wished to give freed persons an interest in the soil, Andrew Johnson became president and repudiated Lincoln's promise, or reneged on it. He just, Indian given. Repudiated Lincoln's promise. Proclaimed Johnson, "This is a country for white men, and by God, as long as I am president, it shall be a government for white men." In less than a full harvest season, the land that Sherman had given to the freed persons was returned to the prior owners. Although the Freedmen's Bureau tried to assert and protect the rights of the formerly enslaved, the Bureau under President Johnson perpetuated racist stereotypes, paternalistic attitudes, and continued to limit African Americans' economic and social power. Bureau agents often viewed formerly enslaved African Americans as children, unprepared for freedom, and needing to be taught the importance of work and wages. The Freedmen's Bureau abandoned the possibility of land reform in the South and focused on labor relations between black and white Southerners instead. Bureau agents did protect black workers' rights by invalidating enslavement-like labor contracts, and they enforced contracts that settled wage disputes at the end of the harvest season. However, the Bureau also harmed African Americans by acting on the racist belief that African Americans avoided work, and it was the Bureau's responsibility to reform such laziness. One commenter noted that emancipation only meant liberty to work or starve. General O.O. Howard, director of the Freedmen's Bureau, stated that African Americans must enter labor contracts regardless of the contract terms because any black man who can work has no right to support by the government. To this end, Bureau agents withheld social services and food in order to force African Americans into labor contracts, prosecuted black workers who broke labor contracts, enforced vagrancy laws, and imposed other restrictions on African Americans' mobility. The Bureau allowed plantation owners to deduct unfairly large sums for supplies and rations until many workers would receive little wages at all. The wage guidelines for black workers provided less pay for black women regardless of their productive capacity. Nonetheless, the Freedmen's Bureau met severe resistance from Southern politicians. In 1866, President Andrew Johnson vetoed the bill extending its existence past 1 year, and it was only enacted once Congress overrode the veto. 6 years later, in 1872, Congress bowed to pressure from white Southerners and dismantled the Bureau. Interjection. Yeah, now we need to revive said Bureau. All right. Black codes and other laws controlled black workers. Immediately after the Civil War, black codes passed by the state and local governments in both the North and South governed the conduct of free African Americans. Free African Americans posed a threat to the racial hierarchy of slavery, and black codes were a range of laws to maintain the lower status of African Americans through restrictions on movements and activities, often in order to compel them to work in menial jobs for low pay. The 13th Amendment to the Constitution outlawed the institution of slavery, but it allowed involuntary servitude as a punishment for crime. Mostly Southern states and local governments used this loophole to develop a system of laws often built around vagrancy laws that turned African Americans into criminals, and then allowed the government to turn those labeled criminals into de facto enslaved persons, forced to labor without pay or freedom of movement. For an in-depth discussion of convict leasing, please see Chapter 11. Vagrancy laws passed by the numerous states criminalize unemployment. An 1865 Mississippi law required African Americans to enter into a labor contract with white farmers by January 1st of every year, or risk being in violation. Violating such laws risked a criminal conviction that allowed the state or locality to force the African American to work without pay. Means of compelling labor of African Americans persisted even after some forced labor provisions were repealed. Other states used open-ended fraud and false pretenses laws to punish workers who had received advances and then breached contracts without repayment. Some jurisdictions use black codes to limit opportunities available to African Americans. Some laws prohibited employers from hiring workers who were already under contract. Contract law, labor law gave employers nearly unlimited power over workers and often their family members as well. And individuals who quit jobs could be arrested and returned to their employers. South Carolina enacted a statute in 1869 that criminalized simple breaches of labor contracts. Probate contracts could order that black children be apprenticed to their former enslavers. For an in-depth discussion on apprenticeship, please see Chapter 8. In South Carolina, African Americans were required to apply for a permit to work that was not agriculture. These codes often reinforced enslavement even after it had been outlawed. So you needed a permit to get a job outside of agriculture. Again, sounds like the child work permits that they need. Just treating black people like children. Oh, that was an interjection. Okay, back to it. Later, as the Great Migration began, states also enacted law to discourage African Americans from migrating to places elsewhere in the country that offered better work opportunities with improved conditions and higher pay. After the Civil War, interstate labor recruiters known as immigrant agents helped black workers leave the South towards better jobs in the North. The Southern states lost large numbers of workers, and even when workers did not move, the possibility of leaving improved black workers' bargaining power. The Southern states responded by passing laws that required immigrant agents to pay high license taxes. The Supreme Court in 1900 ruled that one such law was constitutional and allowed Southern states to hinder the ability of poor and rural black laborers to move towards better jobs elsewhere. The Supreme Court announces separate but equal. In 1866, Congress overrode President Johnson's veto to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1866, the first federal legislation banning discrimination on the basis of race. As discussed in other chapters, the Civil Rights Act of 1866 was aimed at ensuring that African Americans had the same legal rights as white Americans. However, while criminalizing violations committed under color of law, the act did not provide any civil remedy. The Civil Rights Act of 1875 allowed individuals to pursue a monetary penalty against businesses and other public accommodations that discriminated against African Americans. This protection lasted only 8 years. However, before the Supreme Court in 1883 decided in the civil rights cases that the 14th Amendment did not apply to private parties. The decision allowed private employers and other businesses to discriminate openly against African Americans with no repercussions. Together with Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, which condoned the doctrine of separate but equal. The Supreme Court decisions created the ability for both private and public employers to entrench an inferior labor market for Black workers. The lower wages, fewer protections, and limited opportunities for advancement for the next 100 years. Lack of government protection from violence. In both the North and the South, federal, state, and local governments neglected their duty to protect Black workers from violence as a tactic to limit the job opportunities. White landowners, employers, vigilante groups, and others used violence and terror, more closely examined in Chapter 3, to deter African Americans from earning fair wages for their labor and achieving economic success. For decades following emancipation, lynchings targeting African Americans who attempted to wield some political or economic influence, or even take a step as limited as demanding pay for their work. While private actors often were the perpetrators of these brutal killings, federal, state, and local governments, in failing to prosecute racial violence, accepted its use to limit economic and political opportunities of African Americans. Legal segregation. During the brief period of Reconstruction following the end of the Civil War until the 1870s, radical Republicans in the federal government passed laws increasing African American economic and labor freedoms. This included rights to change employers, keep a portion of crops grown through cooperative labor, and change locations, but this progress was temporary. After the Union Army withdrew from the South, as discussed in chapters 2, 3, and 4 on enslavement, political disenfranchisement, and racial terror, respectively, Southern states passed laws and white Americans used racial terror and violence to prevent African Americans from voting. The Southern Democrats took back control of the state and local governments across much of the South and built a power base in the federal government. In the South, state and local governments passed laws that created a formal, legally enforced system of segregation. The federal government supported this system. Supported this system. With a series of Supreme Court decisions culminating with Plessy versus Ferguson, official acceptance of separate but equal Jim Crow segregation regimes in 1896. Segregation affected all aspects of African American lives, including voting, marriage, education, transportation, access to public accommodations, and labor and working conditions. For example, South Carolina passed a statute that essentially required employers to create two separate workspaces, as it forbid white textile workers from working in the same room or using the same entrances, exits, pay, windows, doorways, stairways, or windows at the same time as Black workers. Black textile workers in South Carolina could not use the same water bucket, pails, cups, dippers, or glasses as white workers. Not only did such laws directly regulate the labor of African Americans, they also made it more expensive to hire Black workers when such additional facilities were required. In order to be compliant with state law, an employer would need to pay twice for compliant facilities if they hired any Black workers. Many employers simply refused to hire any Black workers. As a result, most of the jobs available to African Americans were menial and service jobs. State and local governments' refusal to enforce the economic and civil rights of African Americans in contract and employment disputes allow white Americans to exploit and discriminate against African Americans. African Americans in the South mostly remained in agriculture in a sharecropping or tenant farming system. Sharecropping and tenant farming emerged in the late 1860s and lasted until the 1940s, tying Black workers to agricultural work and rendering them unable to pursue other opportunities. A sharecropping or tenancy agreement typically involved Black workers and tenants paying rent to a white farmer while living and working on the rented land. The tenant farmer purchased supplies including seed, fertilizer, and tools on credit from plantation stores that then attached significant markups to the supplies and charged high interest rates, often locking the tenant farmer into a permanent state of debt. Tenants were required to pay off debt before leaving the farm, and landlords enforced these requirements with threats of violence. For decades, federal authorities did little to limit peonage, even after the Supreme Court declared the practice unconstitutional. Although the sharecropping system also exploited poor white farmers, an added layer of racial terror plagued Black sharecroppers. With no hope of government or legal protection in the South, an African American challenged a white American at the risk of severe violence or death. For example, 1948, two white Americans beat a Black tenant farmer in Louise, Mississippi, because the Black farmer had asked for a receipt after paying for his water bill. If a Black farmer tried to sell agricultural product without the landlord's permission, he could be whipped or killed. They could never leave as long as they owed the master. That made the planter as much master as any master during slavery. That interjection, that's what I was thinking. I'm like, how is this any different than slavery? Okay. So back to it. As much the master as the master during slavery. Because the sharecropper was belonged to him, almost like a slave, the grandson of a sharecropper told Isabel Wilkerson, the Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and author of both The Warmth of Other Suns, The Epic Story of America's Great Migration, and Caste, The Origins of Our Discontents. One reason for preferring Negro to white labor on plantations is the inability of the Negro to make or enforce demand for a just statement or any statement at all. He may hope for protection, justice, honesty, and from his landlord, but he cannot demand them. There is no force to back up a demand, neither the law, the vote, nor public opinion. Even the most fair and most just of whites are prone to accept the dishonest landlord as part of the system, wrote anthropologist Hortense Powdermaker. Elsewhere in the country, the Great Migration, as discussed in detail in Chapter 1 and 5, brought African Americans from the South to the North, Midwest, and West. Blacks, though native born, were arriving as poorest people from the poorest section of the country with the least access to the worst education, wrote Wilkerson. Largely excluded even from better paying jobs and even the menial occupations, Black workers in the North and West earned the least money when compared with the white recent immigrants at the time. In 1950, African Americans in the regions had an annual income of $1,628. Italian immigrants made $22.95. Czech made $23.39. Poles made $2,419, and Russians made $2,717. Until well into the 20th century, Black women could mostly only find work as domestic servants for white employers. Following the Civil War, new career opportunities opened for women in the fields of teaching and nursing. Black women who entered these professions could only work in segregated facilities. A few decades later, private employers hired mostly white women as receptionists, department store clerks, and telephone and machine operators. Black women took over household work as white women, including white immigrant women, moved into these better paying jobs with set work hours. In both the North and the South, Black female labor participation rates were double those of American-born white women and triple those of immigrant women. During the first half of the 20th century, the number of white female domestic workers fell from 1.3 million to 542,000, while Black women went from accounting for 30% of the household workers around 1900 to about 60% of the household workers at the end of World War II. Some Black women working as servants lived in their employer's home and were on call 24 hours a day. Other Black women resorted to what was colloquially referred to as slave markets, where they gathered on the street corners early in the morning to wait for white housewives to bid on them for as little as 15 cents an hour. One woman in Chicago slave market reported that she made 50 cents a day, the same money as she would earn for picking cotton in the field. In each of these eras and through the present, civil courts did not protect African Americans to the same degree as white Americans. However, there were exceptions. One scholar has found evidence that African Americans used civil courts in the district in Mississippi before the Civil War to vindicate their rights in claims over contracts and wages, and found that in many instances, these litigants won their cases. But discrimination remained built into the law. Several states, including California, prohibited Black persons from testifying against those who were white. African Americans additionally face de jure and then de facto exclusion from juries. Some states explicitly ban African Americans from jury service, while others tied jury service to voting, which was then limited to white men. Exclusion continued by other means after the Supreme Court in 1879 ruled that a West Virginia statute limiting jury service to white men violated the 14th Amendment. Other forms of discrimination, including segregation, also limited access to justice. Over time, in addition to the racial terror discussed in Chapter 3 and the political disenfranchisement discussed in Chapter 4, the civil court system also contributed to a failure to protect African Americans against the theft of government taking of property, which often has been a source of income and sustenance. For example, in 1856, an enslaver, Thomas Howlett, directed that his plantation be sold and the proceeds given to his enslaved African American workers. who were to be freed upon his death. 2 courts upheld Howlett's will over the challenges of Howlett's white relatives, but formerly enslaved workers never received the proceeds from the plantation sale. In another example, in 1964, Alabama sued 2 cousins, Lemon Williams and Lawrence Hudson, claiming that the 40-acre farm that the family had owned and operated since 1874 belonged to the state. A state court judge ordered Lemon Williams and Lawrence Hudson off the land, though in the same courthouse investigating journalists found tax and property records showing that the family owned the farm. Oh, went a little too far there. Let's get back. Okay, so let's read that again. A state court judge ordered Lemon Williams and Lawrence Hudson off the land, though in the same courthouse investigating journalists found tax property records showing that the family owned the farm. Barriers to justice, including those outlined above and in Chapter 11, continue for African Americans today. While the relationship between race and civil justice system is under research, studies thus far indicate that African Americans underutilize the civil justice system, including in the area of labor and employment. In a 2016 study conducted by legal scholar and professor Sarah Steinberg Green of low-income minority groups' attitudes towards civil justice system, African American respondents were less likely than white American respondents to have considered seeking help for their civil legal issues, largely because of distrust in the legal system. This lack of trust often stems from prior negative experiences. Black people are more likely than white people to experience biased treatment in the judicial system, and individuals who experience discrimination are often more likely to anticipate and perceive discrimination across institutional contexts. There is also evidence that African Americans are reluctant to complain when they perceive discrimination or experience other grievances. Additionally, social science research shows that litigants may find their attorneys through their professional networks, and African Americans have more limited professional networks. Utilizing the civil justice system and lack of access to justice have particular impacts in the area of labor and employment. African Americans hold a significant share of low-wage jobs in sectors in which wage theft is prevalent, and yet the available evidence indicates that African Americans rarely bring wage theft claims. African Americans are more likely than white Americans to file discrimination lawsuits without a lawyer. A 2010 study found that African Americans are half as likely as white Americans to have a lawyer. In general, less than 5% of workers' discrimination claims go to trial and result in ruling for the plaintiff, and self-represented litigants are significantly less likely to achieve favorable outcome in discrimination suit. Exclusion from unions. Legal segregation laws not only confined Black workers in the South, but also impacted the economy of the entire country. Segregation pitted workers of different races against one another, resulting in, suppression of opportunity for Black workers, and less collective power for workers of all races. 138 unions have a lengthy history in the United States as craftsmen for long joined together to solve problems related to their craft. In the 18th century, strikes, labor organizing, and collective bargaining developed at the same time, and the first authenticated strike was called in 1786 by Philadelphia printers. Unions reached their peak around World War II, as unions grew at the rate of approximately 1 million workers per year. Prior to World War II, many unions refused to accept Black people as members. Since before Civil War, white workers have claimed that Black workers were not suited to skilled labor in order to avoid competition from jobs. In the North, companies and unions did not hire Black workers because white workers refused to work beside them. And for the sake of morale, the companies and unions would not force the issue. White workers sometimes walked off the job to force their employers to rid their workplace of Black employees. Interjection. Bye, Felicia. Get to stepping. All right. Throughout the 19th century, trade unions organized by white workers typically excluded Black workers. In 1902, Black workers scarcely made up 3% of members in unions. In response to exclusion, Black workers sometimes formed their own unions. For example, 1869, Black delegates attended the Colored National Labor Union Convention in Washington, D.C., which was a counterpart to the White National Labor Union. Government actions sometimes supported labor unions' discrimination against Black workers. For example, when the city of St. Louis built a segregated hospital for Black patients, white union members protested the hiring of a single Black tile setter. For example, when the city of St. Louis built a segregated hospital for Black patients, white union members protested the hiring of a single Black tile setter. The city fired the contractor and committed not to hire any contractor that employed Black workers. Okay. So no Black workers helped build the segregated hospital. Okay. Legal segregation both reflected and intensified racial tensions between workers. Segregation made contract between Black and white workers almost impossible, ensuring that Black and white workers would inhabit different worlds and making labor organizing across racial lines more dangerous and less likely to occur. Legal segregation not only held down the wages of Black workers, working class Americans, it also prevented working class white workers from demanding higher pay, as long as Black workers could always be forced to work for less. The American Federation of Labor, founded in 1886 and survived today by the AFL-CIO, initially strived for racial equality as leaders recognized the value of a united working class. However, legal segregation in the South proved to be so influential, the Federation leadership allowed local affiliates to exclude Black workers. Black workers protested exclusion throughout the 1920s and 1930s. Federation's leaders' formal response was that the Federation did not discriminate. Human nature cannot be altered, and Black individuals ought to be grateful for what the Federation has done for them. Scholars have argued that legal segregation and discouraged white and black workers from working together for better working conditions and fostered a racial vision that served the interests of Southern planters and industrialists. For example, beginning in the 1880s, black and white tenant farmers and sharecroppers began to join biracial political parties to challenge the political and business elites in the South. Scholars such as Jacqueline Jones, who testified before the task force, have argued that legal segregation and private racial discrimination were used to disrupt this burgeoning biracial political force. For example, before the Civil War, black women, men, and children worked in the South. After the war, Southern textile mill owners reserved those jobs for white families and advertised hazardous mill work for as well as a welcome escape from sharecropping. This drove a wedge between the black and white rural poor. Exclusion from occupational licenses. Unions also played a part in how states excluded black workers from skilled, higher paying jobs through what eventually became state licensure laws. A license from a state entity is required to practice some professions and trades like electricians and doctors. State and sometimes local governments have designed these licensing requirements so that black workers are less likely to qualify, which has intensified the impact of discrimination by private employers and unions. State licensure system worked in parallel to exclusion by unions and professional societies in a way that has been described by scholars as particularly effective in excluding black workers from skilled, higher paid jobs, while craft unions implemented unfair tests conducted exclusively by white examiners to exclude qualified black workers. For example, across the country from the late 1890s through the late 1930s, state laws allowed local mayors or city councils to appoint the members of the licensing board for plumbers. This meant that the local plumbers union could exert significant influence over who sat on the licensing board. From there, what did the boards do? Erected barriers to avoid licensing black plumbers, such as requiring union apprenticeship, from which black individuals were banned before the applicant could even qualify to take a licensing exam. Other barriers included a high school diploma, which was more difficult for black workers due to education discrimination, as discussed in Chapter 6, separate and unequal education, passing a personal interview conducted by a white person, and sometimes even false test scores. Not failed test scores, but false test scores. These methods, which were used by other professions as well, did not ban black workers outright because these statutes were outwardly neutral. Courts have repeatedly found that they were constitutional without questioning the discriminatory motives and impacts. A few courts recognize the dangers of allowing licensing boards to control entry into the profession, but not enough of that to stem the tide. Government support made the discrimination worse. In Virginia, a white plumber explained that his state law requiring members of the plumbers union be part of the licensing board. The Negro is a factor in this section, and I believe the enclosed Virginia state plumbing law will entirely eliminate him, and the imposter from following our craft. By 1924, 24 states and Puerto Rico had similar laws in place. And these laws were effective. In 1973, Montgomery County, Alabama, had only one licensed black plumber who, despite having spent 4 years studying the trade, was told he failed the local exam each time he took it. He was not allowed to see his exam paper or told what his score was. He was finally able to obtain a local license after passing the state master plumber's exam. Charlotte, North Carolina, similarly had only one black plumber in 1968, and in Maryland in 1953, only 2 of the 3,200 licensed plumbers were black. The impact of these exclusionary efforts is still felt today. In 2021, the Bureau of Labor Statistics estimated that 87.2% of plumbers are white and only 7.1% are black. The use of licensure to regulate jobs increased dramatically after 1950s, when only 5% of professionals required licensure in the United States. In 2018, roughly 21.8% of professions required licensure. Some of the reasons for this increase include trying to professionalize and legitimize certain jobs and overall growth of fields that have historically required licensure. Regardless of the reason, one result of the growth is the discriminatory licensing standards have become more widespread, even if the standard did not intend to exclude black workers. The result was exclusion. One such method today is the ban on licensure for people with criminal records. As discussed in Chapter 12, Mental and Physical Harm and Neglect, state and federal governments have criminalized African Americans throughout our nation's history, resulting in African Americans being more likely to have criminal records without necessarily committing crimes at higher rates than other races or ethnicities. Race discrimination and disproportionately in the criminal justice system, thus combined with laws like those excluding persons with criminal justice system involvement from licensure to close off avenues for work. It is difficult for people with criminal records who are disproportionately black to find jobs, even if their records are old or have little to do with the job, or if they have demonstrated rehabilitation. When a license is required, those challenges can become insurmountable. One 2016 study showed that there were 27,254 state occupational licensing restrictions against people with criminal records nationwide, 12,669 of which involve restrictions on licensure for people with any type of felony conviction, and 6,372 of which involve restrictions for people with misdemeanor conviction. 19,786 licensure restrictions were lifetime bans, and 11,338 were mandatory and allowed no discretion by the board. In some instances, upon release, formerly incarcerated persons cannot work in the very profession for which prison job rehabilitation programs train them. All right, we're just gonna stop real quick for a quick interjection on this because, Governor Gavin Newsom did just sign into law here in California a law that is going to seal the records of, people who have served their time and haven't gotten into trouble for, I believe it was a 4-year, if you stay out of trouble for 4 years, your record will be expunged. And just for this very reason, people just, records follow you for a lifetime. You're unable to get employment. So that's one good thing that Governor Newsom did this bill signing cycle. That, and of course 2296, which keeps our reparations task force on track to sunset in June of 2023. All right. Prison jobs, rehabilitation programs, train them for. For example, while many prisons provide training programs, on barbering, laws in every state prevent a formerly incarcerated person from working as a barber. Recently, efforts have begun to reform these criminal record exclusions. Several states have now passed laws to revive licensing restrictions related to people's criminal records, but thousands of restrictions still remain. A database funded by the United States Department of Justice shows that there are currently 12,989 consequences of having a criminal record for various licenses nationwide. Discrimination in promotion and pay. During World War I, Black voters began to make headway in previously white workplaces and industries. Black men took blue-collar jobs previously held by immigrants who had shifted employment to the war effort. Black women took jobs previously held by white women and boys. Black workers might earn 300% more doing industrial labor in the North than they earn doing agricultural labor in the South. As discussed in Chapter 1 and 5, these job opportunities in the North and West led approximately 3 million African Americans to migrate from the South between the World War I and World War II, and another 5 million to move between 1940 and 1980. Wherever they landed in the North and Midwest or the West, African Americans found more discrimination, which translated into racial job ceilings. Pay differentials and segregation by job type, for example. Ford Motor Company refused to employ Black workers at a level above general labor outside the Detroit area. And in the Chicago stockyards, Black workers were excluded from jobs as foremen, as they were not permitted to supervise white workers. In the urban industrial South, Black workers were categorized in lower level jobs, helping white workers who would simply supervise work while taking home the higher wage. One Black employee at the Firestone Company's Memphis plant described how you'd be classified as a helper, but you'd be doing all the work. The white man would get the high wage, but he'd just be sitting there watching. As a result, Black workers were penalized both with lower wages and fewer advancement opportunities. Yeah, that's that. And this is just me, my opinion, just the, slavery, modern day slavery. And that's the overseer just sitting there. They're watching. All right. Black workers were often only hired in jobs that were far more physically dangerous. For example, Ford Motor Company foundry where many Black workers were employed, had a lack of safety equipment, for poor ventilation, and management induced speed ups that led to workers' injury and death. One foundry worker described others finished a shift so matted and covered with oil and dirt that no skin showed. We could only tell a friend by his voice. The pattern continued across manufacturing sectors for decades. Black workers were limited to lower paying categories, barred from supervisory roles, and denied opportunities for advancement. For example, by 1970, 1/5 of auto workers in Detroit were Black, but Black workers remained all but completely excluded from higher level positions. In 1968, Black auto workers formed the Dodge Revolutionary Union movement to protest racism at the plant. A writer in the organization's newsletter laid out the stark segregation and discrimination then present at the plant. 1. 95% of all foremen in the plants are white. 2. 95. Did I say 95 on number 1? 95% of all foremen in the plants are white. 2. 99% of all general foremen are white. 3. 100% of the plant superintendents are white. 4. 90% of all skilled tradesmen are white. And that, interjection, that 90% numbers still exist in industry today, controlling 90% of everything. 90% wealth gap. Yeah. All right, and there's more to this. So number 5, 90% of apprentices are white. 6, systemically, all of the easier jobs are held by white. Number 6, whenever whites are on harder jobs, they have helpers. 7, when Black workers miss a day, they are required to bring 2 doctor's excuses as to why they missed work. 8, seniority is also a racist concept since Black workers were systematically denied employment for years at the plant. This trend was not limited to manufacturing. In 1950, salaries of college-educated workers in both the North and South were significantly lower for African Americans across industries. For example, Black managers averaged an average annual salary of around $1,400, while white managers averaged closer to $3,500. In today's dollars, this translates to monthly salary of approximately $1,396 for Black managers and $3,489 for white managers. Discrepancies like this existed in professional teaching, farming, clerical sales, and skilled technician occupations as well. Exclusion from New Deal protections. In the 1930s, the federal government under President Franklin D. Roosevelt sought to remake the relationship between employer and employees. The New Deal transformed American society and set in motion the creation of the middle class. But for white Americans, the New Deal reshaped the role of the federal government in providing for American citizens. Programs funded under the New Deal infused a huge amount of capital into the economy. 2 researchers have estimated that the federal government spent almost $27 billion on various New Deal public works programs between 1933 and 1943. Southern Democrats who rose to power by preventing African Americans from voting through a combination of violence and voter suppression laws forced President Roosevelt essentially to exclude African Americans from New Deal programs and legislation, while Northern liberals at the time would not support explicitly racist language in the programs and statutes. The Southern Democrat racist aim was accomplished in the structure of the programs themselves. In order to pass numerous New Deal laws, President Roosevelt compromised with the Southern Democrats to ensure their votes by largely excluding jobs from mostly held by African Americans from the New Deal protections like unemployment insurance, minimum wages, equalized bargaining power, or anti-child labor laws. Agriculture, rural and domestic service workers, and anyone with seasonal or part-time jobs were excluded from these benefits. Approximately 85% of all Black workers in the United States at the time were excluded, although some historians disagree that the federal lawmakers intended to discriminate against African Americans. Oh, I see. Just one big misunderstanding. And that's an interjection, by the way. Congress also compromised to allow New Deal programs to be administered at the local level. By the design of the Southern Democrats in Congress, Southern local white government officials were in control of local relief efforts. Individuals who held the view that African Americans should not receive relief of any kind if white Southerners had laundry to be done or cotton to be picked. While Black Northerners received some governmental jobs and assistance, Black Southerners did not. The following is a non-exhaustive list of labor-related New Deal laws and programs and the ways in which they have discriminated against African Americans. Many of the New Deal laws created the foundational structures that continue to provide Americans with a social safety net. National Industrial Recovery Act of 1933. The National Industrial Recovery Act created the National Recovery Agency, which established industry-specific minimum wages and employment protections. The National Recovery Agency eventually enacted over 540 codes providing for minimum wages and maximum hours in different industries. Many employers advocated for explicitly racist codes before the agency. One argued that Black workers made a much better workman and a much better citizen. Insofar as the South is concerned, when he is not paid the highest wages. Okay, so keep them broke and compliant. And that's just me talking. But anyways, while explicit race bias codes were not adopted, the structure of geographic and occupational classifications in the code often accomplished the same goal. An industry code would classify a state as either northern or southern for the purpose of setting a minimum wage, with southern states often having a lower minimum, and different occupations governed by different codes at different minimum wages. For example, One example demonstrates how the government used both geographic and occupational classifications and exclusions to pay Black workers less and provide them fewer protections. Delaware was classified as being northern and thus subject to higher minimum wage for 449 industry codes, but was classified as being southern and thus subject to a lower minimum wage for the fertilizer industry, where Black workers made up 90% of the industry. John P. Davis, in a speech to the 25th Annual Conference on the National Association of the Advancement of Colored People in 1939, stated, "The one common denominator in all these variations is the presence or absence of Negro labor. Where most workers in a given industry are Negro, that section is called South and inflicted with low wage rates. Where Negroes are negligible, the procedure is reversed." The purpose of occupational and geographic differentials in the wage codes was clear to those involved in implementing the National Industrial Recovery Act. At the same time, the executive director of the National Recovery Agency Labor Advisory Board wrote in 1934, "To the degree the South rate is the rate for Negroes, it is a relic of slavery and should be eliminated." The same year, Ira D. A. Reed of the National Urban League wrote in the newspaper The Chicago Defender, "The Negroes' initial attitude towards the National Recovery Act is best reflected in the interpretation of initials given by one observer who called it Negro Riddance Act." National Labor Relations Act of 1935, Wagner Act. The National Labor Relations Act of 1935, NLRA, or Wagner Act, proposed by Senator Robert Wagner, dramatically increased the power of organized labor by allowing officially certified unions in certain sectors the right to negotiate on behalf of all employees, if supported by a majority of workers. The National Labor Relations Board, NLRB, the agency designated to administer the law, was able to hold hearings and resolve disputes involving union representation. The NLRA harmed African Americans by purposefully allowing unions to discriminate based on race and by failing to cover sectors of the economy that mostly employed African Americans. This undermined the bargaining power of Black workers and their ability to participate in the newly recovering economy for decades. All right, so I know it's a little over 10 o'clock here. This is a pretty long chapter. So let me see where we're at here. All right, let's see here. Okay, Social Security Act. All right, you still with me? You still with me? I think I'm going to get through a couple more pages just so you know we're kind of evenly yoked on today's reading and Monday's reading. So if you want to hang with me, great. If I understand you got other things to do on a Friday night, this will be here for you to come back and listen to at your leisure. So just give me a quick sec. Be with you back with you in a moment. All right, we're back. All right, so the NLRA harmed African Americans by purposefully allowing unions to discriminate based on race and by failing to cover sectors of the economy that mainly employed African Americans. This undermined the bargaining power of Black workers and their ability to participate in the newly recovering economy for decades. And still to this day, I just added that part about to this day. Labor unions have played a critical role in the development of American society and the day-to-day experience of the American worker. During and after the New Deal, workers and employers' power was uniquely balanced, which enabled an unprecedented improvement in the condition of the working class in America, the benefits of which continue to be seen today. For example, workers with strong unions have been able to set industry standards for wages and benefits that help all workers, both union and non-union. Union workers are more likely to be covered by employer-provided health insurance. More than 9 in 10 workers covered by union contract, 94% have access to employer-sponsored health benefits, compared with just 68% of non-union workers. As another example, union workers have greater access to paid sick days. 9 in 10 workers covered by union contract, 91% have access to paid sick days compared to 73% of non-union workers. While Black leaders proposed amendments to the NLRA to prohibit government certification of a union that did not allow Black workers to join and have all rights, the American Federation of Labor, the principal white-dominated federation of craft unions, opposed this protection due to its desire to eliminate competition from Black workers. The American Federation of Labor and Southern Democrats won, and the final law protected the bargaining rights of unions with racist membership policies that gave white labor organizations the power to exclude Black workers from contract negotiations and implement their racist views in the union contract protected by the federal government. The final law also excluded agricultural and domestic workers, another compromise to the Southern Democrats. Federal law essentially allowed unions to ignore and discriminate against Black workers by protecting segregated unions. Unions refused to admit Black workers or afford them the privileges of membership, segregated Black workers into less skilled jobs, and used collective bargaining rights to force employers to replace Black workers with white workers, while the NLRB, the federal agency charged with administration, the NLRA, stood out of the way. For example, the NLRB certified building service employees unions in New York forced Manhattan hotel restaurants and offices to replace Black elevator operators and restaurant workers with white employees, and the federal agency took no action in response. In 1944, the U.S. Supreme Court held that unions were obligated to represent their members without discriminating on the basis of race. but did not require them to eliminate racial segregation in their membership or provide Black union members with a mechanism for enforcing their civil rights. Only in 1964 did the federal agency finally decide that it could revoke a union's government certification due to its racial segregation. Even then, individual Black workers still had limited recourse against racist union leadership. Employees subject to a racist union could not deal directly with their employer. Instead, additionally, even after the NLRB stopped certifying white-only unions, seniority rules meant that Black workers would need years to secure wages comparable to those of white workers. Social Security Act of 1935. The Social Security Act of 1935 created old age and underemployment benefits to help seniors and those out of work. This landmark law followed the same pattern as the rest of the New Deal legislation in limiting how its benefits applied to African Americans through occupational carve-outs for agriculture and domestic labor, and allowing local rather than federal administration, although some historians dispute the allegation that Congress acted with racist intent in making these programs. That means central to the government's efforts to ensure some minimal level of financial stability, including retirement insurance, unemployment insurance, and aid to families with dependent children programs. During the debate over Social Security, Congress acknowledged that the preponderance of Black workers in the agricultural and domestic labor sectors, but excluded these occupations despite accusations of racism. Charles H. Houston testified on behalf of the NAACP. In these states where your Negro population is the heaviest, you will find the majority of Negroes engaged either in farming or else in domestic service, so that unless we have some provisions which will expressly extend the provisions of the bill to include domestic servants and agricultural workers, I submit that the bill is inadequate. African Americans advocated for a non-discrimination provision in the statute as protection from the racist local administration of previous New Deal relief statutes. For example, one activist pointed out that in the local administration of past emergency measures, there had been repeated widespread and continued discrimination on account of race and color, as a result of which Negro men, women, and children did not share equitably and fairly in the distribution of benefits accruing from the expenditure of such federal funds. Congress did not include such a provision in order to secure the support of Southern Democrats. Charles H. Houston expressed the view of many African Americans. If we follow the history of the Workmen's Compensation Act, we know that two great classes of workers who will be excluded from the benefit of unemployment insurance. They are agricultural workers and domestic workers, but let me scroll up to the top, and domestic workers. Again, 3 out of every 5 Negro workers drops through the holes of the sieve. Fair Labor Standard Act of 1938. The Fair Labor Standard Act of 1938, FLSA, which is still in force today provides the federal minimum wage. The minimum number of working hours before overtime pay is required, and the limits on child labor, like other New Deal laws, in order to appease Southern Democrats. The law purposefully excluded certain occupational categories like agriculture and domestic services, preventing the majority of African Americans from benefiting from the law's protections. Because of these exclusions, the FLSA essentially outlawed child labor in industrial settings where most white children worked at a time, and allowed child labor in agricultural and domestic work where most Black children worked. Members of Congress were clear about the racist intent. For example, Florida Representative J. Mark Wilcox explicitly stated, "You cannot put the Negro and the white man on the same basis and get away with it. Not only would such a situation result in grave social and racial conflict, but it would also result in throwing the Negro out of employment and making him a public charge. There's just is not any sense in intensifying the racial problems in the South, and this bill cannot help but produce such a result." Okay, quick interjection. You know, I'm hearing the same talking points about reparations these days. Oh, you just can't do it. It's going to cause a race war. We're going to have a next civil war. I think we can, make it happen and start to heal as a nation. All right, back to it. Congressman Cox of Georgia specifically objected to the possibility of equal wages because of the impact it would have on relieving the economic subjugation of African Americans, central to the social organization of the South, stating the FLSA will, in destroying state sovereignty and local self-determination, render easier the elimination and disappearance of racial and social distinctions. As with other New Deal legislation, Congress included the agricultural and domestic service exemptions in order to secure the support from Southern Democrats needed to pass the legislation. So they knew it was racist and they put it in there anyway. All right, y'all. I think I'm going to end it right here. But we will get back to it on Monday, same time, same place, 8:30 p.m. Pacific Standard Time over here at ETM Media YouTube channel. So thank you for joining me tonight. And we will see you Monday. Have a great weekend. And peace, love, and reparations.
The way it currently stands, forced labor, slavery takes precedence over rehabilitation and public safety.
Oh, by the way, while the Biden administration gives reparations to everyone but free people, look at the billions he has run over to Ukraine.
We don't have Black grocery stores because if you think about it now, just to get in that supply chain, it's almost unheard of.
They don't want the truth to get out. Okay? I don't want to know what my family did or what all these people did and all this stuff like that. Okay? You read that 500-page report.
There's this thing called white superiority and black inferiority. That mindset allows all of the behaviors that we've seen across generations, allows for the construction of these policies and practices and systems and structures that continue to oppress us.
This is not a handout. This is a debt that is owed.
You know, Allensworth was like the internet of his time in 1904, 1905.
The total black population in California is about 2.6 million, and then of that, the descendants compose about 2.2 million of that. So California, with a multi-billion-dollar surplus, can absolutely afford to satisfy the international terms for reparations, beginning with compensation.
Any financial obstacle that exists that impedes the success of increasing financial prosperity needs to be dealt with and eliminated.
No matter where we've been, no matter what part of this fight we've been in, we've been harmed, and we've had harm done to us specifically.
When I got to Los Angeles, this was some of the worst segregation I'd ever seen. And remember, I'm telling you, I'm from Mississippi.
Because as you can see, I'm giving you broken history right now, you know? But I had to give it to you guys today. I said, no, I got to show them this because it's so precious and nobody really knows about it.
Black people don't have that kind of luxury. Our historically black communities have been redistricted multiple times.
Now listen, if you can't handle the TR roof, don't tune in.